Michael Jauer, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, Dr. David, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having
Well,
me.
it's a pleasure to have you here. And when you reached out to me to talk about your work, and somebody I think had suggested to you that this might be a good outlet for your ideas, and then it turned out that actually you've been a long time listener to the show, at least off and on. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah. And then as we talked about, well, what are we going to talk about and so on, you gave me a little bit about your background. And I was intrigued to learn that you are in Washington, D.C., and that you've had a kind of, in addition to what our main focus is going to be here, which is your work on the interaction between our emotions and chronic illness. So we're going to be talking about that as kind of the broad focus. But you have had a professional career in government as a consultant and various kinds of roles. And am curious to ask you, because we've just had the January 6th hearings, which I watched, and we had the January 6th event, which was a very upsetting event of kind of a revolt. So I want to ask you, what is the atmosphere there, and what's been the impact upon you emotionally, since we're going to be talking about emotions? So tell me about that.
Right. January 6th is coming up, I guess, in about 2 weeks.
Yeah, right. Again, yes.
Yeah, again, it was a revolt, and it was revolting, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Um,
mine too.
yeah, I think most of the country at this point would agree, and that's a good thing. Um, DC was kind of under lockdown for a while. Um, in the weeks and even months after January 6th, there was really a feeling, at least on Capitol Hill and in the district itself, a large part of the district. Now I'm outside of DC. I'm about 15 miles west. But I did go downtown, and there was a kind of a siege mentality. It was an attack on the people's house. It was an attack on all of us, and it felt that way. And so, for weeks or even months, there were chain link fences up and all kinds of barriers, physical and emotional, which was very off-putting. And that atmosphere has dissipated at this point, but it's left in effect.
Yeah, wow. Well, I would love to talk more about that because I think would be a lot to explore there. But I do want to get into the main focus of your work, which, as I mentioned, was your work on the interaction between our emotions and chronic illness. And you've written one or more books with a Dr. Mark Mycosy. Am I saying his name right?
Correct. Yes. Mark Mycosy. Yep.
Yeah. And as you and I chatted, we discovered, and as I read the acknowledgments in your book, in one of the books that you had written, and all kinds of people that we know in common, either that I've met personally or I've known for a long time, or so I was just amazed to see how much overlap there's been in our careers, even though we're on different sides of the country, and you're not a professional psychologist, you're more of a researcher and writer, and so you feel like a professional psychologist. We know a lot of the same people in psychology. So how did you first become interested in this topic anyway? Because I think for a long time, at least in my world and the world of psychology, clinical psychology, the kinds of people that I interview, there's been a pretty long understanding, I think, now that mind and body are connected, and that our emotional life can impact our bodies. But you've gotten into kind of a pretty specific slice of that. How did you first become interested in this topic?
Well, probably like a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists who are trained in those professions, um, my growing up influenced it. You know, I noticed my parents were very distinctive personalities, and I think that's the case in general. Opposites attract, and so you can't
Huh.
help but notice those divergences. Um, and I think I became aware, Dr. Dave, at some point, probably in my mid to late teens, um, that I was um, holding emotion at a distance, that I wasn't feeling things as I should.
Huh.
And I went into therapy for that and got a lot better at it, but it's been a lifetime pursuit. Um, and that's why the Ernest Hartman's concept of thick and thin boundaries well, it grabbed me from the start when I became aware of that, because I realized that um, I was probably on the thicker side of the spectrum. It took longer for me to realize what I was feeling. And I could feel things very intensively, but sort of after the fact. Um, and that bothered me. It actually bothered me. And that's why I went into therapy. So I've gotten better at that over the years, although it's been a long slog. And my wife could tell you I still don't register things as quickly as she does. She's much
Right.
a more thin boundary person, but I've gotten thinner over the years through a lot of tough work, challenging work. So that's on the personal side. I would say also what influenced me is kind of an interesting experience I had um, when I was in I guess my second job out of school was working for an association called the Building Owners and Managers Association, BOMA, which represents um, commercial real estate professionals, the folks that own and manage office buildings. And my assignment was working with the US EPA to develop guidance, voluntary guidance for building operators to prevent something called sick building syndrome. And
Wow.
I don't know if you've heard of that or your listeners have heard, but sick buildings, sort of a euphemism for just a structure or a situation where more people are reporting illness that they attribute to something in the building, that they feel better when they're not in the building, and
Yeah.
they are at some sort of disadvantage in the building. And there's something called building related illness. It's really kind of a catch-all phrase, and the EPA was trying to parse these things and in cooperation with us and with other real estate groups, try to figure out, well, what sort of guidance could head off a so-called sick building and could help people not to feel ill in their workplace. And as part of my assignment was to talk with these folks, interview them. And interestingly, at the time, there were folks in commercial real estate and sort of observers who were looking at them and saying, well, it's all in their heads. It's, quote,
Yep.
psychosomatic. They're making it
Yes.
up. They don't
Right.
want to work. There's some problem in the workplace, and they're attributing it to the building. And I thought, well, that's entirely possible. But in talking with them, I realized that they had a few things in common with my spouse. For example, my wife has been asthmatic basically since she was born. And she reacts very quickly. For example, at that time, um, there was mold in a particular room in our house, and we were using it as a joint office. And she was reacting to that, and I wasn't so much. I would notice some stuffiness, sort of a smell that wasn't entirely pleasant. I knew we had to do something about it, but she couldn't breathe terribly well. She would start to wheeze. And that was at the same time I was interviewing these folks for this project with the EPA. And I thought, perhaps some of them are sensitive to elements in the environment that are unseen and, uh,
Yeah.
cause of mold, the spores and so forth, they're unseen, but nonetheless, a very intensive reaction. Perhaps it's not all in their heads, it's something physical as well. And it's psychosomatic in the sense that it's something with the body that's also affecting their mental perceptions and their emotional sense of what it's like to be at work.
I have, I know that many people say that neon lighting uh, is makes them feel ill in one way or another. Others have talked about the impact of air conditioning and on their sense of well-being. And I have a friend who uh, was sensitive to Bluetooth, so that if Wi-Fi was Wi-Fi, I guess if the Wi-Fi router was on in her house that her mate used a lot, she would know, and which is kind of amazing. We don't think of people being having that level of sensitivity, and yet we are a piece with the animal world, and we know that we have some of the same sensitivities, but not to the same degree. And most of us aren't aware of the of our animal self to that degree. So
Right. You've
this
pegged
is
it.
fast. Yeah. Go ahead.
Your use of the word sensitivity pegs it, and I contend that people um, differ to some extent in their level of sensitivity along a spectrum. Some people are very
Sure.
highly reactive
Yeah.
and very aware of what's causing it, or at least bothered by it, and other people, not so much. Um, what you mentioned about Bluetooth, for example, there is a phenomenon, and I became aware of this around the same time I was working for BOMA and learning about the factors involved in indoor air quality. In fact, there were two kinds of conditions that were very curious and still are. One is called multiple chemical sensitivity, where
Okay.
people seem to react to trace um, elements in the atmosphere, perfumes, colognes, solvents, cleaning agents, paints, adhesives, pesticides,
Yeah.
and most people don't, but some people apparently react quite viscerally to that and get bothered by it. And then about Bluetooth is something called electrical sensitivity. And this is very well documented, especially in Germany and the Scandinavian countries. For whatever reason, it's kind of a major topic, or has been more on their radar, and the UK as well. There have been studies commissioned by the governments in those countries to try to get a better handle on electrical sensitivity. But there are people who apparently, or at least they claim, to be able to react to lights, as you say, um, computers, vacuum cleaners, anything and everything electric bothers some people, and it's a big
Yeah.
question as to why that is.
Yeah. And it's I know I know at the university that I taught at for so many years, there was growing awareness of the environmental kinds of factors, and that we were being called upon to be emotionally compassionate and sensitive to the needs of students who had these kinds of complaints. And I blush to confess, that it kind of stretches my boundaries to because it feels like, oh, who these people are such namby-pambies is probably I don't think I ever actually said that or articulated it as clearly as that, but there's a kind of irritation. I think I suspect I'm not alone. You know
No,
that
you're not. And in fact, when I was starting to get familiar with these issues, um, that tack was very common, and probably still is when you're talking about people. Uh, it's relatively rare, but in some sick building situations, you have a number of people that are complaining. But the logical, or sort of the most immediate reaction most people have, is, what's wrong with you people? Even the
yeah, yeah,
definition of a sick building is 20% of the building occupants are reacting to something. Well, that means 80% are not.
yeah,
So, majority rules, right? Majority is going to look down their nose and say, what the heck is wrong with you people?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, gluten is another one. People who are gluten insensitive, and if you're not gluten insensitive, that can be kind of hard to understand. And it seemed something about today's world probably that, in fact, we are exposed to more environmental, potentially toxic, irritating stimuli than our ancestors were, and that's why it feels like, oh, there is a epidemic of these kinds of picayune things going on. but I think it's because we were living in artificial environments that in fact are extremely toxic.
Yeah, there's a lot more to contend with in our society today and on the cusp of 2023 than there ever has been. People are paying a lot more attention to what's in their food and whether
Yes.
that's good for them or not. What I became fascinated with around this time, which was the mid to late 1990s, was the conjunction, at least the way I saw it and continue to see it, between environmental sensitivity and emotional sensitivity. Because when I was speaking with these folks who'd been affected, evidently, by poor indoor air quality, there was something, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but they reminded me of my wife, Bonnie. They reminded me both in their reactivity to the environment and in their quickness to react, which was not a forte of mine. Like I say, I tend to be more someone who doesn't understand or doesn't realize what he's feeling until after the fact in many cases. And these folks seem to be immediate reactors. And so I was thinking, what is the connection, if any, between someone's emotional constitution and their physiology?
Yeah.
And that's really
Yeah.
been the basis of much of my work over the years.
Right. Earlier, you mentioned Dr. Ernest Hartman, and that was another place where we had this overlap that was I was surprised to discover because I, for a long time, was a member of the International Association for the Study of Dreams, or IASD, wonderful organization. And he was very high in that hierarchy. I think he was on the board, and I heard him speak a few times, but it was more about his research on nightmares, I think. So I never got to hear him talk about thick and thin boundaries, which is something that you've been focusing on a lot and you attribute to him. So tell us about that thick and thin boundaries.
Right. Well, first, I should tell you that it's a fellow Northern Californian who, I don't know if you've heard of her name, Elaine Aron, Dr. Elaine Aron, Aron. She and her husband, but she's kind of the lead in this endeavor, her work on highly sensitive people. Her first book was called The Highly Sensitive Person, or HSP, and she's worked on this probably a quarter century. And it was talking to her led me to Ernest Hartman, because she and I were talking and she said, oh, you'd be interested in this boundary concept of Dr. Hartman's. And I said, what? Who? So
Yeah.
I reached out to him and he was at, unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but at the time he was at Tufts University in, I think, Newton, Massachusetts is where he lived. And I called him up and was thrilled when he called me back a week or so later, and we corresponded and met over the ensuing years. And you're right, he actually came to his theory of boundaries through his study of dreams and nightmares. And what he
Fascinating.
discovered was that folks who had nightmares were, in his parlance, thin boundary. In other words, sort of the boundary or the threshold, you might say, between their dream life and their waking consciousness was breached. In the case of a nightmare, you're literally woken up by emotions, and images that are too tough to contain. They just literally wake you up and shock you awake. And he began to put pieces together to look at those folks who were prone to nightmares and other folks who slept blissfully and might not even remember what they dreamt. And that's sort of the spectrum they ended up developing, is the thin to thick boundary spectrum. So the thin people he called dream people, folks who really remembered their dreams, had vivid dreams, they dreamt in color. He called them dream people. And the other people on the other side of the spectrum who rarely remembered their dreams or didn't remember dreaming in color, he called them daytime people, I think. And that was his original conception. And then that turns into thin and thick boundaries.
Now, for years I taught a class on dreams, undergraduate class, and we broke up into small groups, and a lot of that was influenced by other people who were involved in IASD and so on. So I certainly had that experience of some people are great dreamers. I'm somewhere in the middle, I would say. One of the things I learned is that if you're paying attention if you're doing things that are paying attention to your inner world, like journaling or meditating or something like that, I think the likelihood of dream recall seems to go up and to be somewhat correlated with that. But I definitely
Absolutely right.
I would have students, for whom this was all like kind of like mumbo jumbo, and they had stumbled into this class, and now they had to put up with these people who are all excited and interested in their dreams. And then there were these other people who it seemed like every night had fantastic Jungian type dreams, of marvelous, richly textured landscapes and so on. And the dreams would go on and on. And so there really is a whole continuum. And let me hasten to say here that either at the very last interview that I did, the most recent podcast, or maybe it was two back, I'm not sure, was all about the highly sensitive person and these people who've created a website that's devoted to catering to the highly sensitive person. So this kind of event has me always thinking about synchronicity. I can't get away from it because I don't think you contacted me because of that interview that I had. Did you? I don't think so.
No, I'm thrilled to hear of it, and I have to go back a couple of weeks and see what I was missing.
Yeah. So to me, it's just it's amazing because sometimes the interviews will kind of go in waves of topically and be related without any conscious intent on my part to say, okay, now I'm going to do a group of interviews on X or Y. So welcome, welcome from the wider universe that brings things in. So where are we now? Also, I get the feeling that what you're talking about also borders on a hot topic, I think, within psychology, which is psychological flexibility as a major personality variable. Is there some overlap there? Are you familiar with that concept?
Is that synonymous with resilience or close to it?
Well, it's very close to it. Yeah. Yeah. I guess in some ways, yeah, it probably comes out of that same literature, maybe. I'm just pausing for a moment about that. But several major theorists have come up independently equating psychological flexibility with mental health.
Yes, yes. There is quite a bit of overlap. And a moment ago, you used the word continuum, to look at people along a continuum. So you have extremely thin boundary people, you have people who are relatively thin boundary, people right in the middle of the spectrum, people who are somewhat thick boundary, and extremely thick boundary, right? And I think when it comes to resilience, one important element, at least from my vantage point, and I think if Ernest Hartman were here, he would agree, is to see people, yourself and everybody else, as being along a continuum. So that, yeah, you can have extremes and sort of scratch your head and go, well, why is that person that way? But also apply that to yourself. Well, where am I on this continuum? And is there necessarily this is the part of the continuum that I want to be on, that I want to be at? And when I do book talks, people often ask, well, I test more thick than thin. I'd like to be thinner. And other people say, well, I test more thick than thin. Vice versa. I test more thin than thick. I'd like to be thicker. So people, it seems, are rarely happy 100% with where they are,
Uh,
and they want to
uh,
learn how to cultivate some of the other tendencies that often their partners have more than they do. And sometimes maybe this is to assuage their partners so have a happier relationship. But I think it really boils down to flexibility, and flexibility would be the linchpin of resilience. So if you know
yeah.
where you are, you respect that there are other people on other sides of you on that spectrum, and that everybody is in flux. Probably very few of us are 100% thrilled with where we're at. And of course, life is movement anyway, right? Life by definition, if something is dead, it's not moving. There's
Yeah.
no reactivity there. So we're always trying to learn and grow and um, be maybe a little bit different, a little bit better in at life. And I think that's maybe getting to what you're talking about.
Well, also, what I'm hearing and what you're saying is that there really isn't a value judgment uh, that to be all on the thick side or all of the thin side is 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 the best way to be, but rather that they're both important to different ways of being along a spectrum, ways of being in the world. And
Absolutely
uh,
right. And
yeah,
Hartman actually has his boundary questionnaire. When you score it, there are 145 items, and they
wow,
break down into a dozen different categories. So I don't mean to suggest that it's monolithic, that you're either here or you're there. A person's overall score is going to be a reflection of where they are thick and thin in 12 subcategories, and then it just sort of grades up into an overall score. So none of us is completely one or the other. And when I think of resilience, I think of us, like you say, being less judgmental about other people, but also less judgmental about ourselves. That we're
yes,
very
definitely,
complex amalgams at any given moment, and that changes throughout our life. I mean, when you're in your 30s, you're different than you are now. When I was in my 20s, different than I am now. Different than we're going to be 5 years from now, or even 2 weeks from now.
yeah, yeah, and that for me also dovetails with uh, meditation, the whole world of mindfulness meditation, which is about setting judgment aside and accepting the complexity of our mental and emotional experiences, and instead of having a huge judgment about it, observe it, accept it, and let it go, and then see what comes up next. Let's talk about the connection to chronic illness, because and you sent me a couple of recent papers that had come out referring to some rather unexpected places where thick or thin boundaries or other personality typology ideas are related to the prevalence or lack of certain diseases. For example, there's so much that we're not consciously aware of. Our gut, our bowel. A lot of research now that shows that the biome is so totally complex and is related to our emotional life and so on. So you're the expert here. I want you to talk about that.
Well, it's a theory, and it's a theory that Dr. Makosi and I have propounded. I believe it holds up to scrutiny.
Yeah.
Um, and it's based on the idea of thick and thin boundaries. That in some people, um, they're more highly reactive, they're more aware of what they're feeling, and in other people, much less so. Uh, Feelings have a very definite strength. There's an energy to them. The word emotion conveys the quality of movement of feelings. You can't really pin them down; they're
Uh,
constantly in flux. Um, that doesn't mean, however, that you can feel a feeling um, and then it's necessarily gone. You may ruminate on things, something may stick with you, it may become a preoccupation, a major concern. And what we talk about in our second book, which is called Your Emotional Type, is chronic health conditions. And these are conditions that we propose are more about the mind-body relationship than about any particular bug or any particular germ or gene. So that the conditions that we're talking about, it could be hypertension, migraine, ulcer, chronic fatigue, chronic pain, asthma, allergies, psoriasis, all of these different conditions, we argue, are a lot about how a person unconsciously handles feelings and the energy of feelings, and particularly difficult feelings that may not be immediately apparent even to a thin boundary person can manifest in these kinds of conditions. So what we took a look at was we looked at something called it's called the HPA axis. You would probably know the abbreviation better. The hypothalamus has a role in it. Hypothalamus pituitary axis, HPA axis. And we looked to see how reactive in certain kinds of conditions. We looked at serotonin as sort of a marker for the activity of the HPA axis. And so we kind of inferred where people would be on the boundary spectrum if they manifested this particular kind of condition or that particular kind of condition. And so we organized these, we call them the dozen discomforts, into groupings so that some seem to be more prevalent as thin boundary conditions, some are more prevalent as thick boundary conditions. And then from there, Mark Lucozzi lent his exceptional expertise, which is in complementary and alternative medicine. Now, it's evolved to be called, I guess, complementary and integrative medicine. But what kinds of therapies would be beneficial, most beneficial for folks who are affected by these chronic health conditions? Yeah. So the book, Your Emotional Type, is really kind of a menu of therapies based on your boundary type and the kinds of conditions you might be most susceptible to because they are more than a particular germ or a particular identifiable cause. It's not COVID. It's not the common cold. We're talking about more complex conditions that really have to do with what's happening within. And our contention is how people handle the energy of feelings.
I'm struck by the term, the 7 discomforts. Can you remember them off the top of your head? What are the 7 discomforts?
It's the dozen discomforts.
Oh, the dozen, I'm sorry.
You're right on the 7 because we identified what we call the Super 7 treatments, the complementary and alternative or integrative treatments.
Oh, I want to hear about those too.
Have the most evidence behind them, or at least did about 10 or 11 years ago when we released this book. But the 12, the dozen discomforts are asthma, allergies, chronic fatigue, depression, fibromyalgia, hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, migraine, PTSD, psoriasis and eczema together, rheumatoid arthritis, and ulcer.
Okay, I'm sure there's something that binds those together. Well, and I guess that's kind of what you're getting at. That somehow they're tied into how we deal with our emotions and that we differ in terms of emotional style, which is probably unconscious. We probably each have an unconscious emotional style, if you will. Is that a good word? Style?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. There's a great anecdote in the book. There's a psychiatrist in Australia, if I'm remembering, or maybe New Zealand, who I was reading one of his papers, and he had a married couple in for therapy, and she was paralyzed from the waist down. She had been in an auto accident or something. She was paralyzed, and they were having a very difficult conversation about their sex life. And she was saying, I want to have as much of a sex life as we can, and you're not treating me like a full human being. You're treating me like damaged goods. And the husband was complaining that, you know, it took so much of his energy to look after her, and he barely had energy to have any physical relations. And it was a very contentious, very difficult, you know, fraught conversation.
Yeah.
And the writer of this paper, Stephen Appel, it just dawns on me, Stephen Appel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I think it's Appeel, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
He said, I took all of this in, you know, and it was his job to try to help them navigate these shoals. And he said, it was after the session was over, I felt like I had been just hit with a ton of bricks, and I got a migraine for my troubles. And so here's a guy who's conversant with feelings. That's his stock and trade, right? Is to help
Yeah.
people when they come into treatment, help them parse these things. But it was such a difficult conversation. You know, the stakes are incredibly high. He didn't react to it immediately, but afterwards he said he got a migraine. And the way Dr. Mukosey and I look at this, migraine is indicative of a thin boundary personality where nonetheless the energy of that feeling or feelings goes underground and it's sort of dissociated. And the power of the dissociated feeling manifests in the migraine. Whereas somebody else who maybe is constitutionally thicker boundary wouldn't have a migraine, but would get an ulcer later on. Or would deal with chronic fatigue, let's
Yeah.
say. So that's our contention, and there is evidence for it, and that's the kind of thing that we cite as evidence. It's anecdotal, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, as well as the HPA activation that we use to sort of figure out which conditions reflect which boundary type.
Yeah. So tell us about the 7 treatments that emerged, at least at that time, as best suited to deal with these kinds of things. And of course, I think of, well, I believe Dr. Hartman was trained as a psychoanalyst. Am I right about that?
Yes, in fact, his father, you may know, his father, Franz Hartmann, was a disciple of Freud. He was in Freud's circle way
Uh-huh.
back when.
Wow.
So yeah, he comes from that tradition.
Okay, so tell me about the seven approaches, but I have to believe that some form of depth psychology is going to be important, whether it's psychoanalysis or something else.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Jungian psychology before, and synchronicities and so forth, and I became highly interested, thoroughly interested in depth psychology. James Hillman and Jung, probably around the same time as I was getting interested in all this other stuff in the mid 90s. But
Yeah.
I've actually spoken to the Jung Society of DC, I think 3 times at this point, and that's anyway. We can get into that. But the Super 7 of therapies are acupuncture, hypnosis, biofeedback, meditation, yoga, guided imagery, and relaxation techniques. Those are the 7.
And I've been involved with all of those in the course of my training and personal experience. So that's yay.
It covers a good part of the waterfront, maybe
Yeah,
most of it.
yeah, yeah.
We also, by the way, we have an appendix in our book, Your Emotional Type, where I guess it's actually the last chapter, is called Pushing Boundaries. And we talk about energetic therapies, bioenergetics, Reiki, things like that.
Right.
Which sort of came to our attention as we were finishing up the book. We didn't delve into them, but we sort of, it's the last chapter and sort of a PS. And so that was where we learned a few things in getting the book together.
Yeah, I would think that the whole suite of body therapies would be really important for this discussion.
Yeah, therapeutic touch and all of that.
Yeah, yeah.
because
Uh,
they revolve around concepts of energy. Um, People involved in those kinds of therapies consider themselves very often energy healers, which sounds kind of esoteric, but if you think that emotion, if you conceive of emotion of emotion as energetic, then there's definitely physiology to it and
I'd never,
biology.
yeah, I'd never made that connection before. The way you broke down the word emotion as having motion in it, that's never occurred to me before. It seems
Well, the
so
Latin,
obvious.
I'm big on etymology, and I always like
Okay,
looking up. Me
yeah,
and George Carlin. I used to like George Carlin a lot because he would
all
focus on
right.
words and what they mean and what they signify and the sound of words and so forth. And that always stuck with me. And um, one of the first things I did before I started to write anything was to look up the definition and the root of emotion. And the Latin verb is emovere or emovere, I think, which means to move from or to move out of. And I think that the root of words can be very instructive.
Yes.
They go back, thousands of years, but they give you some sense of what the original meaning of the word was, which we may or may not recognize today. And I do believe that the motion of emotion was recognized early on.
How's a listener to assess? You talked about a test of thin and thick boundary. How is a listener or a viewer of this interview to proceed from here to have some sense of what chronic illness they either already have or need to guard against, and relate that to what kind of treatment they should be seeking?
So our website has all of that information, and it's youremotionaltype.com. And thanks to Hartman, he not only developed the boundary questionnaire, which is 145 items, but he recognized there was a need for a simpler way in to the concept of boundaries and for helping people to peg where they are approximately on the boundary spectrum. So there's an 18 question short form of the boundary questionnaire, which if folks come to youremotionaltype.com, they'll see it immediately. And we've set it up so that someone can go through the 18 questions and it's scored automatically. And that'll lead them to pages about, well, what does this mean? What kinds of chronic conditions might you be susceptible to? What does this mean about your emotional style, as you said, your sort of unconscious predilection for reacting? It's not something
Yeah,
anybody really has total control over, but you become better aware of it by virtue of taking the quiz.
that's great resource to learn about. I'm definitely going to put that in the show notes so that people can find that and go there. Um, we're getting to be
We really
short
mean for
on.
the site to be pragmatically helpful for folks. It's,
Yeah,
we've talked a lot about the boundaries concept and what it entails, but ultimately our goal with this particular book and website is to help people practically choose a kind of therapy that's not going to have downsides. It's not like taking particular drugs or having surgery. There are very few downsides with the Super 7 therapies, and we're trying to align those therapies with boundary type and with type of chronic condition.
yeah. I'm just looking at some of the notes that you sent me of possible things that we could talk about, and one that kind of sounds interesting to me. Why is disgust an especially useful indicator of boundary function? So that's interesting. Disgust. Yeah.
Yes, I became aware of disgust not through Hartman's work, but through the work of a guy named Jonathan Haidt, Haidt.
Oh yeah,
He's at New York.
I've interviewed him. Yeah.
He's a fascinating person. I've gotten a
Yes.
chance to talk with him briefly. I've heard him speak, and he's at NYU, and he's very interested um, in people's political predilections and why they might lean left or lean right or be somewhere in the center. And he wrote about disgust, and I think others have as well. Disgust is a reflex that all human beings have to keep stuff that's poisonous and harmful to us out of our systems.
Yeah.
So it's physiological, it's biological, but it's also conceptual, because we can be disgusted by certain fashion trends or art or music or political opinion. People say, "Oh, that disgusts me. I don't want to traffic with that." And that's what Jonathan Haidt started to look at. And it turns out that people who are more readily disgusted tend to be on the conservative side politically. And I would explain this through the prism of boundaries, as thick or thin, that people will wall themselves off from that which is disgusting more readily if they're thick boundary. If they're thinner boundary, they're more open to experience. That was something else that Hartman discovered, he and his colleagues. There's a clear connection between thin boundaries and openness to experience. And if you're more open to experience, you're less likely to say, "Blah, I don't want to see or hear or know from that. I might be disgusted initially, but I might also find it intriguing. I might want to check it out a little bit and not write it off completely." So that's why I believe that disgust is a pretty good barometer, if you have to pick one, of where somebody is on the thick to thin boundary spectrum. If they are completely, totally disgusted genuinely by it, they're probably more thick boundary. And if they're curious about it, they're probably more thin boundary.
You mentioned the political spectrum, which brings me back to your day job, because I remember when we were first sending email back and forth, and I asked you to generate some topic ideas for me, since I hadn't read your book at that point, and you said, "Well, right now I'm pretty busy with my day job, but when I can get around to it, I'll send you those bullet points." And that intrigued me. Your day job, you mean you have a day job over and above all this other work that you're doing on personality and chronic disease and book writing and so want to go back there. Tell us more about your day job. You mentioned the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Who else have you worked for? What other kind of work have you done with the government? And how do these ideas help you in working with? Because you must see a lot of demonstration of them within the government and its functioning and malfunctioning.
It's a great question, Dr. Dave. I've worked for the government and I've worked with the government. So when I was representing an association like the Building Owners and Managers Association, I was working with the EPA, which I did for a number of years, but I've also worked directly for the federal government. I was with an agency called the General Services Administration, which takes care of civilian buildings. They own a lot of buildings. They are the biggest owner of square footage in the country, and probably they lease more space than anybody else as well. So I continued my interest, my vocation in looking at people as building occupants when I was with the GSA, and we continued working on indoor air quality and energy efficiency and workplace productivity, those kinds of things with the GSA. But since then, I've represented organizations and I've been a consultant. These days, I work as a consultant for a company that serves the VA, and we try to help the VA to be better organized. But I think that the experience that's most informed my interests in the writing and speaking was not only BOMA, but it was I was 5 years representing the naturopathic profession, which naturopathic doctors are integrative physicians.
Right.
And for example, they believe first and foremost food is medicine. That's their basic platform, their fundamental the way they approach patients, and they look at um, what's causing the illness and try to get to know the patient holistically, as opposed to saying, well, you're presenting these symptoms or that symptoms, and that's the prescription I'm going to write is based on that particular symptom you're presenting. They try to get a sense for the whole person, and
Well,
it was representing.
that directly dovetails with the research and writing that you've been doing,
Well,
right?
I didn't necessarily know that it was going to. I knew that it reflected pretty well, but it also it pushed me a little further because for 5 years that was my day job, and I was representing the naturopathic profession on Capitol Hill and before the FDA and other agencies. Um, but it helped me to understand how naturopathic doctors are trained and their philosophy, and that certainly has carried over to my subsequent work.
So was that an accident or did you design to move in that direction
I,
because you
I
had
wanted to I wanted to work on behalf of an integrative health organization because of the work Mark Makosi and I had done with your emotional type. I became
uh-huh.
familiar with many more organizations that um, advanced these kinds of therapies. So I just sort of put my toe in the water and tried to latch on to one of those organizations. And I was fortunate that um, it's called the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians, AANP, brought me on board, and I believe I did some good work for them over about 5 years.
That's just great. What about the American Psychological Association or the American Psychiatric Association? Have you had any call to interface with either of those?
Um, Many of the people I've queried over the years and corresponded with and tried to talk to have been APA members for a start. Folks like Stan Krippner,
Yep,
um,
good friend.
we were talking about before, Eileen Serlin
Yeah.
with the APA. Stan actually invited me to be on a panel um, in 2011, I think it was, and I was out in San Diego speaking at an APA conference, I think their annual meeting. There's another group also that sort of parallels APA. I haven't dealt too much with the American Psychiatric Association, but there's another one, and the abbreviation isn't coming to me. Um, Maybe after the show, it'll dawn on me.
Yeah.
They they've written, their members have written a lot about uh, the person as a psychosomatic individual, the combination of psyche and soma.
Yeah.
And it's a little more progressive than the APA in that way. I just can't think of who they are, but I've
Yeah.
trafficked a little bit
Yeah.
with their members as well.
There are so many
APS,
alphabet
I think
or
it's called the American Psychological Society, APS.
yeah, there is that.
I think that's them.
Uh-huh. Well, this has been fascinating, Michael. And I really applaud the work that you've been doing on yourself. You know, your original call to this was kind of a sensitivity to your own inner world and a sense of wanting to move within that space, and then that you've parallel to all of that you've been moving in the world of government, and that's carried you to all of these really fascinating directions. And then you've done some significant collaboration with professionals and written professionally. So you're a wonderfully well integrated guy, if I say so. and
Well, I've
and
gotten that way. I've become that way um, through this work, and so it's an avocation in the best sense. And my wife would be pleased to tell you that I definitely know much faster these days what I'm feeling, what the prompts are than I ever have before, and that's a really good progression for me.
well, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's a real pleasure, Dr. Dave. Thank you for having me, and thanks for the conversation, the interchange.